Hi, this is Loren Schoenberg. I'm the senior scholar at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, and welcome to Jazz for Curious Readers. This is a program that we've had going for, about 15 years or so. And this evening, we'll be talking to Marsha Durham. Now, she writes under the name of Topsy M. Durham because Topsy is the most famous song written by her father, the late Eddie Durham. So her author name is Topsy M. Durham, but I've known her for 40 years or so as Marsha, so I'll probably call her Marsha during the course of the interview. She's here to talk about The Genius of Eddie Durham. It's the first of a six-part series of incredibly researched and fascinating books about her father, who was one of the great innovators in jazz. He did for Kansas City Jazz what Jelly Roll Morton and Duke Ellington did for their kinds of jazz. Wrote a lot of famous tunes, was a pioneering electric guitarist, trombonist, composer, arranger, led a wonderful all-female band during the Second World War called the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, wrote some of the most famous tunes of the swing era, arranged, had a hand in the Mood for Glenn Miller. I mean, it's a fascinating story. So let me welcome the author, Topsy M. Durham, a.k.a. Marsha. And Marsha, tell us about the book.
So this is a series. It's a compendium actually, and I have about 6 books to go with in this series that I'm working on. And let me just put it out there. I am looking for a publisher, so I put the first book out independently on Amazon, and at the time they came out with the print option, which they didn't have before, and it was a beta program, and they chose my book for their beta program, and it did very well according to their statistics.
Well, as well it should. Let's just start by just establishing the context here. Could you talk about the book, about what it covers, and the basic outline of the story, and then we'll get into how you started to write it and how you became an author.
Sure. The book covers, the first volume covers the period up to 1940 when my father then started to work with the all-women's band, all-girls bands. So he was born in 1906 in San Marcos, Texas. And so it covers from that time period in Texas through the bands that he was with, which would have been the Oklahoma Blue Devils, Benny Moten's orchestra, Cab Calloway, Willie Bryant, Teddy Wilson. He was with Jimmy Lunsford and Count Basie, of course. He recorded the Kansas City 5 and 6 sessions for John Hammond, and a couple of other bands that he worked with, Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, and Artie Shaw as well. And then it ends there, and the volume 2 will be all of the ladies that he worked with, all the women's bands, the 1940s.
Well, how did you get the materials? Because one of the things about the book that kind of amazes me is the tremendous amount of research, the tremendous amount of information about the early years in Texas. I had assumed incorrectly that a lot of that stuff was just lost. That there would really be no way of tracing it. And it was such a pleasure to dig into the pages and chapters and all the great depth. How did you just start working on the book, and when did it and when was that?
I started, oh boy, maybe 30 years ago when my father passed away. I wanted to do a documentary, and I started doing that, and I attended some classes, and began filming interviews of a lot of people who were still alive then, and Al Gray, Benny Powell, David Lum, and my brother, Illinois Jaquette, yourself, actually, and Rudy Lawless, Theo Wilson's son, and I interviewed all of them. on camera. And then I realized that documentary wasn't going to happen for many reasons. And so I started to put it into a book. I started transcribing all of the interviews, and that's how I got quite a bit of the material. But the very early stuff comes from stories that my father told us over and over again as when we were little children up until teenagers. I mean, it played like a recording in my head. The very early stuff about his family and the circuses and his brothers and his mother, because my father was 25 years older than my mother. So his mother was not alive when I was born. His father died a long time ago, and only two of his brothers were still alive, which I did meet, but I was young. So it mostly came from stories that my father told us. And from that, because of, the age of the internet now and being able to go back and research all these newspapers, because I knew what to look for, I was able to find a lot of corresponding information, or I should say corroborating articles about the family band in very old newspapers, and with pictures and things like that. But also, my eldest brother, Eddie Durham Jr., who was born in, I believe, 1929, he did a family tree. So obviously, he's much older than I am, right? And he did a family tree, Eddie Durham Jr., my father's firstborn. And so we didn't pay it any mind for a long time, but I had it. And when I started to put everything into the book, I started to look at it and realize what a treasure that was as well. So that's how this all came together.
Sure. It's fascinating because the oral history tradition is something that people talk about, but here's an actual case of it, where, with your dad's stories and passing it along and then being able to corroborate the stuff. I mean, it's unbelievable for folks who don't know about the early years of your dad. Of course, everyone knows, the famous songs he wrote for Count Basie and the records with Lester Young and Glenn Miller and all the rest. But could you just give us a little bit of a sketch of his early family life? Because I think anybody who reads the book will be fascinated to get so deep into Texas around the turn of the 20th century. I mean, it seems like so long ago and so far back, but it's your dad's story.
Right. These stories that my father used to tell us when we were children, we didn't know they were true. And my father, how he can tell a story. So, but in his adolescence, he's introduced to multiple instruments by his eldest brother. First of all, his father was the town fiddler, and he made his own fiddle, and they attempted to amplify it with rattlesnake rattles. And so my father and his brothers used to go and hunt rattlesnakes and take for the rattles, and they would sell the rattles and they'd put them in the violin, and somehow it supposedly was amplifying his fiddle. So he's already trying to amplify something in his adolescence. And but he's introduced to multiple instruments and music notation. His eldest brother was the musical director for Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and he taught all of his brothers various instruments. Him and his and Earl. Okay, I'm sorry. It's Joe Jr. was the eldest brother, and then Earl. And Earl apparently was a virtuoso also on all of these instruments, because Earl was the leader of the Durham Brothers Orchestra, which they formed. So his they were all performing live in circuses, and they also have three cousins with them, one of which is Herschel Evans, and they have an extremely organized friend, Edgar Battle. So he's touring with eventually he breaks off from some of the family members, and I believe that Joe Jr. is is with Eddie most of the time because he's 12 years older than Dad, and Dad is, pretty young. He's a teenager. So I'm pretty sure, my grandparents had a rule that Joe had to be with Dad and most of the brothers most of the time. But anyway, they're touring with these circuses, and the circus has a white band and a black band, and Dad is in, and they're all in the black band, and these are enormous bands, so they're learning to arrange and all of these different types of bizarre instruments that are thrown together, and eventually he's runs into Jesse Stone, and he's in Jesse Stone's band, and Jesse is a tremendous, writer. So he's with Jesse Stone, and Buster Smith is his best friend, and that's how it builds into the rest of his career without going too far.
No, it's an amazing story, and the way that you tell the story in the book is just so wonderful, because you go to great length to set the context and to, I don't know, I just felt like I was kind of living it with Eddie at the time, because I heard some of the stories, that you're referring to, not as many and not as in great detail, but talking about it here in 2022, we're talking about something that was 110 years ago, or just about 100 years ago. He would have been 16 100 years ago, and it's kind of amazing. I guess we should just state the obvious here, which is that your dad was probably about in his 50s when you were born, I guess.
He was exactly 50.
Right.
When I was born. I was born in 1958.
Right.
So Eddie Jr. is born in 1929, around the time Dad is with the Benny Moten band. No, he's
Walter
with
Page's
the
Blue
Devils.
Right.
Blue Devils, yes. And then I have a brother and sister older than myself, but only by a couple of years. And then I have a brother and sister younger than myself.
Right.
So.
Yeah. What about, I'm just curious, you mentioned names that are so well known in jazz history, Buster Smith, of course, the great alto player who was Charlie Parker's mentor and kind of father figure, and Herschel Evans, who was, the other tenor in the Basie band with Lester Young. He died very early, but, just legendary things. There seems to be something about Texas musicians. I don't, just something in their sound, something in the rhythm, something in the music. What did you come to learn about or understand about just Texas?
Well, one of the things that I learned is that the Texas musicians seem to read music, which was not common for Black musicians. They seem to be composers, arrangers, and to read music. And that's what I found in common with Texas musicians. And it seems that Kansas City music is really Texas music. It started with the Tex-Mex mixture, and they all kind of graduated up to Kansas City because that's where everything was happening. But that's what I learned in an article written by I can't remember his name, but he wrote an article on Texas, historical Texas musicians, something like that. I can get you the name of the article, and it's very interesting how they pretty much all read music, composed music, and influenced a lot of the bands. Mostly all of the swing bands were influenced by a prominent person from Texas.
Oh, yes. Of the names that you mentioned so far, one that should be better known is Jesse Stone.
Yes.
And I think he was also, well, like all the musicians you've mentioned, and your dad, kind of like a lot of what happened with R&B, and after that has roots back to these guys too. But Jesse Stone was something else. Did you ever get to know him or meet him, or was that before your
I met
time?
him once. No, I met him once, but my father had already passed at Jazz at Lincoln. I'm sorry, at Midsummer Night Swing at one of Illinois Jacquette's nights, you know, and Jesse and his wife were there. But Jesse was probably the first arranger that Dad knew and learned from on a one-on-one basis. Um,
How did that
he was a
happen?
big influence on Dad. I know that my father spoke very highly of him.
You know, it's funny here because on the one hand, I want to ask you to tell us all the stories, but we're also just trying to tell people, frankly, to get this book because there's such great detail in it. Let me just jump away for a moment and just ask about when you started to write it, Marsha. Did you intend to tell his whole life in one book, and then you found out that there was just too much, or from the beginning was it always going to be multi volumes?
That's exactly what happened. I intended to put it all in one book. I got to 250 something pages, and I was only up to 1939, and I realized that it couldn't be one book. And then I also realized that the all girls bands deserved its own book. So the second volume, Eddie Durham and the Ladies of Jazz, it covers, you know, just what it says, just the women. And then I pick up in 1950 in the third volume. Um, and that's exactly what happened. I found that it was just too much to put in one book. So I broke it up, and it's going to turn out to be about 5 volumes because the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band is a volume all by itself as well. He was with them for almost 8 years.
Let's talk about the big break. So your dad's in Texas. He goes to Oklahoma City, and he's with Walter Page and the Blue Devils. And starting in 1929, when he was going to turn 23, in 1929, all of a sudden he's in Kansas City, and Benny Moten, who's the biggest band leader in the whole area and who's very well politically connected, and he has a record deal with the #1 record label in the world at that point, Victor Records. And your dad not only joins the band, but starts to write his own music, and there's his name on the record label.
Right.
And there's even a song called "Oh Eddie." There's all these things, and
Right.
and there's an unknown piano player in the band named Bill Basie.
Right.
All these things. Tell us some highlights of that. Did your dad ever talk about like what he thought was the big moment? I mean, he was so offhand and so modest. How did he talk about it with you?
Well, my father never really talked about the bands he was in. He would tell stories about the snakes and the elephants, mostly about the circus, and how he left us millions, but we were going to have to dig for it, and we didn't have a clue what he was talking about. But now I do, and but he said that they all left the Blue Devils in the summer. He left. He was the first one to leave in the summer of 1929 and go to Benny Moten's, and that he brought Count Basie in to the band, and also
Hot Lips Page, I think, maybe.
Hot Lips Page, and also, let's see, he said it was at his suggestion that Moten hired Orrin Hot Lips Page, vocalist Jimmy Rushin, and pianist Bill Basie, in spite of the fact the band already had 2 piano players, including the leader himself. So, but my father wanted Walter Page on bass, but the Blue Devils leader, who was Page, he resisted joining until 1931. But his arrangements and his compositions produced the 1932 New Brunswick recordings. And my father said that once he came into a band, no one else wrote or arranged for that band. So, he arranged Toby, Prince of Wales, and Moten Swing, which, I mean, he wrote Moten Swing, but he's not credited for it, but he arranged it as well. And like you said, Oh Eddie, And he also arranged Here Comes Marjorie, and he wrote and arranged Lafayette. And these are the classics of the early swing era, and leads to at least one of the roots leading to modern jazz and bebop.
So when you mentioned that your dad told you, that he was going to leave millions, but you had to dig for it. I'm curious, the music business in those days across the board, and then back across the board again for African American artists, were just so exploitative. And what happened with all those copyrights, all those tunes? Were they sold for next to nothing, or did he retain some of them, or is there any way to tell us that part of the story?
Well, anything that he wrote, he did copyright, but there was usually somebody else's name on it as well. Not all of the songs have someone else's name, but a lot of them do. It was common to put the band leader's name on, whatever song you wrote while you were in that orchestra, and so Count Basie's name is on a lot of as co-writer, and so is Benny Moten. But his biggest hits, the money makers right now, is I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire and Topsy. Those two songs bring in the most royalties. I should say not royalties, but sync licenses, meaning for films and stage, and so those are the two songs that really survived and support the family. I mean, there are others like Blues in the Groove and Lafayette that have some income, but those two songs are the ones that really do it.
I remember, how close your dad was with God, I can't believe I'm going to say the late Phil Schaap, which just doesn't even seem possible.
I know, right?
To say that, but Phil used to. I remember talk to your dad about at Christmas time he'd get sometimes a nice check for the Good Morning Blues because it said Santa Claus in the lyrics or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So so those recordings that when he left Basie and went to Lunsford, and then he came back to Basie because the band was failing, and John Hammond came and basically begged him to go back for a year. So he signs a 1-year contract with Basie to help the band get back on their feet. And they write he writes all these classics, and Basie is the co-writer on the songs, right? Rightfully so. I mean, he did help write the songs. But what happened later on, the copyright law, there's this period where you can reclaim your copyrights from the original publisher that your parent or whoever, if you're the heir, you can reclaim it from the publisher that the song that he gave it to. Because in those days, it was a standard 50-50. Publisher got 50%, the writer got 50%. In the modern day now, that's not the case. If you have classics, you can shop them and find publishing deals for 25%, 15%, even 10%. The publisher gets 10 or 15 or 20%, and you're getting the majority. You're getting more of the cut, right? But there is this loophole. If you signed a contract with a band leader while you were in the band, then it's considered a work for hire.
Oh.
So yeah, although you can collect your royalties up until the period that there's a time when you can recapture that, the heirs cannot recapture those songs from that publisher. So it doesn't mean you lose the publishing, but you can't renegotiate with another publisher. It has to remain. So those songs are with Warner Chappell. Good Morning Blues and Sent for You Yesterday, Here You Come Today, and Moten Swing, all those songs from from with Basie, 1937, 1938. So for going back and doing his friend a favor, he got screwed basically. But it's not Basie's fault because he's not alive either. This is the lawyers fighting with the lawyers, and whoever wins. And at the time when this situation came up, maybe 30 years ago, right after my father died, I wasn't, versed in any of this. I mean, it just got kind of dropped in my lap, and I had to kind of figure it all out. And Dean Pratt was a real big help. He had a company called the Jazz Composers Service, and helped me make sense of all of it. But by the time I figured it all out, I didn't know how to handle that situation. I mean, if it had come up now, I could handle it, but the statute of limitations is up. I can't change what it is now. But like I said, you win some, you lose some. Sometimes you eat the bear, and sometimes the bear eats you.
Right.
So you can't get bitter about it. You have to move on, and that's why another reason why I wrote the books, to kind of make up for the loss of income and for my family, and because copyrights at some point do go into public domain. So there's only about a decade left on these songs unless the law is changed again, and so you have to have other income.
Yeah. Let me jump here for a moment because I just heard you when you were talking, and I heard you laugh, and for people who knew your dad, and that's one of the things one of the many things I treasure is you have your dad's laugh, and you have just a lot of him is in you. I'll just put it that way. Sometimes children and parents, you don't really see the parent in the child, but could you introduce your dad? I mean, folks, they know his name, they know the recordings, and the fact that he's among the most influential jazz musicians of all time. But if you were to tell someone who never met your dad about him, what was he like? How would you tell someone about him?
Okay, he's very okay. So first of all, when I was born, he was not touring. He stopped touring, and he was home with us, with the children. There were 3 of us at that time because I have 2 older siblings, right? And then the next sibling is born 6 years later. So he's home most of the time. My mother is home. He's living off his royalties at that point. We have a house in Brooklyn, and we've got dogs. He built a pool in the backyard, with the panels, and he bought swings, and he set them up so that you could get on the swings and swing right into the pool. And we had a pool table in the basement and a ping pong table. So he made childhood great. We played, we had everything there. And he was a carpenter, so he would, whatever needed to be done in the house, he would do it. My brother was always watching him, and now he's a contractor, although he's also a guitar player. And so, we used to sit on his shoulders and rub Vaseline in his hair and stuff. He would, when he would cook, like he would make pancakes, he'd flip them up and let them twirl around, and everything was a show. And he was just dad to us. He wasn't. We had a piano there, and he would write at night, and my brother would be up with him, because he took an interest in music. But we did all the normal family things. We had 2 cars. We had a station wagon and another car, and we would go to this place called Great Eastern, which is like Costco now. And we would shop on a regular basis there together. Everywhere we went, my father went. My mother and father went. Anywhere my mother went with us, my father would usually be going with us as well. It wasn't, my mother was the disciplinarian. My father was not at all. I mean, she couldn't even discipline us around him. She'd have to wait until he had a show somewhere and whatever. But we were one of the only families on the block with a car. And then on New Year's Eve, we'd go out usually as a family to like some kind of a dance where maybe like Jesse Stone might have been playing, or somebody that he knew had a gig, and we would go to their gig, and sometimes he would sit in. Um, so, and then in the summer, we would always take a road trip to some place like Pine Grove, where Peg Leg Bates was there, his friend Peg Leg Bates, and we'd stay a week. And so this was, the type of stuff we did. We'd also go out to this cottage in the woods every summer, and every summer for a week with this other family who had 5 children, and we'd just be out there. It was fascinating to us that it was pitch black at night outside, because we lived in Brooklyn. So family was never secondary. And although his music buddies were his family, once he fathered children, he kept his work local, and he dedicated 2 decades to raising his 5 children. Now, interestingly, this is the last part. He and my mother divorced when I was 15, and the 5 children stayed with my father. So he was a single dad for a few years. I mean, obviously, my oldest brother, the brother that's older than me, and the sister that's older than me, she was 18. And Eric, my brother, who plays guitar, he was scouted by the group Cameo, who became a cult funk band, and he started touring. They were the opening act for Parliament Funkadelic. So he was gone most of the time, and I had access to go to the shows when they were in, at Madison Square Garden or somewhere local. And so, I kind of had a ball, because like I said, my father was not a disciplinarian. So once my mother left, it was just one big party over there. So he's
Marsha,
very lenient
yeah.
and very meek,
When did it dawn on you, or when did you find out about who he was in the story of American music? I mean, the fact that he was a great figure.
Mm-hmm. The first time that I realized anything about him was, I knew he was a jazz musician, a cool dad. He was a jazz musician, and he had shows here and there, because once I was 15, he started playing down at the West End. But my ex-husband was a bass player, and he did a play or I think it was on Broadway. It might have been on Broadway. Maybe it was off Broadway, but it was called Manhattan Rhythm. And it was a show from the 1920s to the at that time, 80s. And one of the songs they were doing was Topsy. And I didn't even know that was Dad's song. I didn't know that was his song. And so I brought my father down. Of course, my father was always, whatever we were doing, he would eventually come. And whatever he was doing, we would eventually, go see him somewhere. So this play ran on for about 6 months. So Dad came down to the show, and they were playing Topsy. And the producer was a guy named John Devlin, and he knew who Dad was. And so so my father told me, "Oh, that's my song." And I took, we went backstage, obviously, and the musicians that were doing the show were, all trained musicians. My ex-husband wasn't. He was just one of these people who was gifted, taught himself bass, and was excellent at it, right? And they all flipped out. It was like, it's Eddie Durham, And what's wrong with these people? Why are they flipping out, And so that was my first experience finding out who he was. And so then I started to, you couldn't really do research back then. There was no internet, as you know, right? Not yet. So we had the records at home, and he was, how he was. He was very subtle, and he didn't brag about what he'd done. And that's one of the reasons why when he mentioned to Phil Schaap, the late Phil Schaap, that he arranged In the Mood, you know, Phil Schaap knew that he was telling the truth because he didn't even realize the significance of that statement. You know, if you go back and listen to the interview, you know, Phil Schaap is going through the Glenn Miller stuff, and he says, "What about In the Mood? Did you arrange that?" And Dad says, "Yeah." And he says, "You arranged In the Mood?" And he says, "Yeah, I arranged that song." And then he starts talking about something else, and then Phil comes back to it and says, "Wait a minute," you know. So that's how I came the first time to know, you know, to start paying attention. Then the next time was we went to see Star Wars, my father and I, together. And he said, "Yeah, that's my song, you know, the Cantina Band song." He said, "That's my song, Topsy," you know. And so that was the second time. I mean, that was something I could relate to because Star Wars was, you know, my generation. It was a big deal, you know. But anyway, that's a whole story in and of itself, how they ripped him off for that one. But I won't go into that. Maybe I'll write a 6th volume about the publishing business.
Yeah. You know, just thinking about your dad, and it was kind of amazing to me that he kept a part of him. I mean, I'm just curious how it strikes you. It seemed to me like there was a country part of him. You know what I mean? Like, I remember like when he would, I mean, even beyond just his, you know, his way of talking, like when we talked about Mary Lou Williams, and he would say Mary, you know, and and that, you know, he left Texas in 1928 or something, but it seems like he always kept part of his personality from those early days, and even like how laid back he was.
Right. Yes. Yeah, I think the laid back part probably, I don't know if I can really attribute it to the fact that he was in, you know, Southwest Texas, and it was very, you know, the early days, you know, it was prejudice and it was dangerous for Black people. Basically, you couldn't be bodacious, but there were some that were, you know, but I guess maybe they didn't live long. I think, you know, it is his personality, but also I think a lot of it has to do with, you know, Dad was like a chameleon. He could fit into any situation and make it work without upsetting anybody, you know. So when I was contacted by the people in Texas, you know, they discovered he was born across the street from the Calaboose Museum, and you know, they arranged I was going to go down there and all this stuff. We were doing a festival, and you know, Johnny Armstead said, "Well, you know, now when you come down here to Texas, it's going to be a culture shock for you, and maybe you don't understand what most of how we talk." And when I went down there, I had no problem understanding them because they all sounded like Dad. You know, it wasn't a problem at all, and I really fit in. I didn't have a problem at all. In fact, if I was to move from New York, Texas would probably be you know, one of the first places on my list. But well, it used to be that way, but now Texas, you know, I don't know, it's too hot in many ways.
That's a very nice way to put it. That's
you know, but I really, really liked it there. I really did. I really had a good time there. The people were great, and you know, when Johnny passed, I was really torn up about that, you know. Yeah. But
what's the scope of the other volumes? Can you kind of lay out like what you have planned? You already mentioned that there's one for the International Sweethearts of Rhythm that, of course, he led during the war years, and and the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band. Of course, Al Vollmer is in his 90s now, and he's still leading the band. What are the other volumes going to feature?
Okay, so the Eddie and the Ladies of Jazz is all the women from 1929 to 1987. And you're going to be completely surprised at who they had worked with. I mean, I discovered that he worked his all girls band backed up Ella Fitzgerald for a whole year, and in her documentary they left that entire year out. And I contacted the person who did the documentary, and he was in shock. And at first he didn't believe me, and then he went and did the research, and he said, you discovered something that evaded all of us. So that part's in the book. And the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band is a diary that Doc Vollmer kept for the whole 8 years of every tour they went on. So it's basically, his diary of that band. It's his story, but he wanted me to include it. Excuse me. And then there's, so that covers the 1977 to 1987. Volume 3 is called Eddie Durham, Century of Secrets. They all start out with Swingin' the Blues and then the name of the book, the title of the book. So Swingin' the Blues, Eddie Durham, A Century of Secrets is from 1950 to till he passed away in 1987. I'm sorry, 1950 to 1977, up until the Harlem Blues and Jazz Band. So some of them, cross over. The ladies in jazz crosses over all of them because it's just the ladies, his entire, and not just him, but his brothers as well. Because his eldest brother, Joe Jr., worked with Blanche Calloway for a long time, and also worked with Nat King Cole. Those are the volumes, and then I hope to do a children's book, after all of those are done, and then maybe one on publishing. If I don't want to put a target on my back, that might be dangerous. I don't think I'll do that.
Well, it's just an incredible thing, and not only is your series important because it's about your dad. Number 2, it's a story told by his daughter. Number 3, it's eternal. These things that you're doing, they'll be on the shelf. The hardcover version, of course, they're also available in Kindle editions. So there's no excuse for anybody who wants to study the music not to know the whole story of Eddie Durham. But I'll just say, the way that you've done it is just worthy of your dad. I'll put it that way. As your dad is to music, I think your book is to his life. And it's just wonderful. Anything in closing that you'd like to cover or talk about?
One thing I want to mention is the website's durhamjazz.com, durhamjazz.com. Also, the highlight of volume 1 is the discography. 2 things: the discography of his entire family, which that took more time than the book. So that is, I think, something that you can't find anywhere else, right? It's pretty extensive, and I tried to find everything that I could, including soundies that they're in. The second highlight of the book is the interview about Glenn Miller with when my father was in the band, because when Glenn Miller's documentary was done, my father was completely left out. He wasn't interviewed, and someone who was planning to write a book about Glenn Miller contacted me and told me that he had interviewed my father strictly about Glenn Miller, and no one else had this information. And he gave it to me. He gave the interview to me on tape, and so I transcribed that in the book. And there's a lot of surprising details of things that people were disputing ever happened, So that's a big highlight in this book, in volume 1, that I think people will really be surprised at. So,
well, the book is called Swingin' the Blues, The Virtuosity of Eddie Durham by Topsy M. Durham. The website is durhamjazz.com. And all I can say is I'll be holding a space for you here for when the second volume comes out. We'll come back and talk about that. Great.
That's wonderful. I appreciate it. And I hope that people will write a review on Amazon when they read the book. And I think this is something that everyone can enjoy.